All right, guys, so Ben asked me to discuss a little bit about flexibility and give you guys the information so you can think more with how I think as far as implementing flexibility into your strength training. So the first thing I want to discuss is, what is flexibility? A lot of people think, if you ask your normal guy, what is flexibility? Oh, it's like the length of a muscle, which is correct to some degree, but we're going to break it down a little bit today and see what flexibility is and what encompasses it, and how you can use it in your training. So the first thing I have written here is flexibility equals balance. So if any of you guys are familiar with Charles Poliquin's work, he's very famous for coming up with basically a structural balance model where he uses given percentages which basically dictate the health of your joints and the risk of injury that you're possibly in. So, one of the ones is you should be able to behind the neck press 66% of your bench press. So, flexibility is essentially balance. It's balance of tension on one side of the muscle or one side of the joint and the other. So, when we have lack of flexibility, generally we have lack of balance. Okay. So if I have a guy who comes in and has, let's say, we'll use tight quads because it's pretty common, then what you're going to notice is there's going to be a difference in strength generally from the quads and the posterior chain and maybe how much he trains them. Most guys that go into the gym, they do the same thing all the time. They don't keep a lot of, different exercises in their training, especially if you come from more traditional background that's not ATG, where you're just basically bench pressing and squatting and deadlifting all the time, and you're not really doing anything else. So that impacts your flexibility because of just generally the patterns that you're using in your training are getting overused, and you're not exposing your joints to multiple other ranges, so the body loses its ability to go through that range. So I drew this little diagram here to explain that basically this is your joint right here, okay? So you are, skeleton with connective tissue, muscle, fat, nerves, and so on and so forth. But if I were to take away all the muscle in your body, your bones would just fall into a little pile. There'd be nothing to suspend and keep them in place. So how we maintain our skeletal structure or our joint integrity is through muscular balance. All right? So our body is literally going to take the shape of essentially our flexibility. Right? So most people these days, since they work desk jobs, what happens is you get really tight quads and hip flexors. They kind of arch the back and pull the pelvis forward. All right, and then what happens there is the neck's going to kind of move forward, so you get this really this sitting posture, and this is basically what people's posture is versus being more restorative, more neutral. So what happens is when generally we'll say the front side of the body, because I've never met an athlete who's just so strong that they walk around like this. All right, most people are here. So what happens is you sit all day, you sit for 8 or 9 hours. Then you go to your local LA Fitness and all you do is bench press, right? So here is the front of your body, and here is the back of your body, right? What's gonna happen is this muscle group gets stronger and tighter. This muscle group is gonna get more stretched out and generally weaker because it's now in a position where you can't generate a whole lot of force. So all this space right here between that joint, let's say this is your shoulder, your arm and your shoulder socket, this joint eventually impinges to the point where if it doesn't show immediate injury over time, you're going to get that joint rubbing on your connective tissue, and you're going to get a whole lot of problems generally down the road. And that's just your very typical, your everyday gym goer guys, does a lot of upper body, bench press, shoulder collapses forward, and then you get like shoulder impingement, rotator cuff injuries, and things like that. So that's essentially what flexibility is. It's balance on both sides of the joint, both here and here. So what you typically, it's just a balance of compressive forces and expansive forces. All right. So I'm just going to erase this so you're not totally overwhelmed. That's essentially how the body works. All right? So what's the big deal with passive versus active stretching? What's the difference? Well, passive is kind of a misnomer in a sense that when you're stretching, you're never just like relaxed, right? We know that if there is tension on one side of the joint, then there's still tension on the other side of the joint, but it's how relaxed is it, right? So, for instance, when I push my shoulder forward in the socket, the muscles through the front of my chest and shoulder are contracted, and now there's flexibility behind the shoulder blades, allowing my shoulders to go into that position. So how far my shoulders can go forward depend on not only the strength of the front, but the flexibility of the back, right? Passive stretching is important. I know recently there's been a lot of kind of discussion about trainers not liking passive flexibility for developing flexibility in athletes, and I think it's bullshit, okay? You have to have passive flexibility before you have active flexibility. You have to have access to it before you can use it, okay? So we're gonna go down here. Patterns of tension. So I just talked about it a little bit, okay? Most athletes that come in the door, you know, they're in class all day, they're sitting, and again, they have terrible lifting habits. So you get a lot of tightness to the anterior chain of the body, you get a lot of passive tension through the posterior chain of the body, okay? Everyone develops tension differently, okay? So some people develop it in the face, some people in their upper body, some people in their neck and shoulders, some people in their hips, some people in their calves, feet, whatever, it doesn't matter. Everyone's a little different as far as where you hold tension in your body, okay? And there's a lot of factors to that, which we're not really gonna go into today. But just know that there's no one size fits all for anybody, okay? The second thing I want to kind of discuss a little bit about flexibility is the ability to breathe, all right? Where you hold tension is dictated by your breathing patterns. So in order to gain flexibility when stretching, you have to learn how to breathe. So it takes most guys anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks, this board sucks, to actually learn how to breathe when they stretch. All right, so I get a lot of guys that come in here, a lot of strong guys, a lot of weightlifters, guys that are just like putting their body through stress all the time, you know, athletes out on the field, etc. Stressful lifestyle, stressful jobs, if they work in the you know, work a desk job or something. They just don't know how to breathe. They don't know how to relax. They're always tense, they're always tight, they're always just like strung and ready to go, and they're not sleeping well. So the first 4 to 6 weeks when we start to develop flexibility, a lot of the progress is going to become learning how to breathe. So this is probably going to be one of the most important factors for any sort of progress in your flexibility. All right. So you got to learn how to breathe. You have to big deep breaths, slow out through the mouth. Okay. Any time that you start to breathe really fast, you start breathing in through your mouth, your body's going to start generating tension because it's, you know, it's basically a stress response, like fear, or apprehension, or things like that. Like that's how your body picks up those signals. So the other big important factor is going to be time under tension. So these two are very important because in order to gain any sort of flexibility, you have to have time under tension. All right. So when most people come in here and they're stretching, I say, hey, you know, have you stretched before? They go, yeah, you know, like after my workout, I'll stretch for, you know, maybe 20, 30 seconds, and then I'll move on to the next thing, and then 5 minutes later, and I'm done. It's not enough. It's not enough time at all. Imagine if you came in and you only did 1 second squats. You're never going to get anywhere with that. There's not enough time under tension to make the body adapt to the stress because you're basically just, you know, dropping on your joints. There's no load. Time under tension is key, both in strength training and in flexibility. You have to spend time doing it, especially in the beginning, okay? So that's mostly going to apply to everybody. I'm at a point where I don't have to stretch a lot because I spent 3 years stretching a lot. And now I just maintain it through my strength training for the most part. But time under tension is key. So, you know, instead of holding things for 30 seconds, Holding things for 90 seconds, 2 minutes is a good start for the lower body, and then anywhere from a minute to 90 seconds is usually a good time to start holding things for the upper body. All right. Another way to gain flexibility is through strength training, specifically eccentric loading. Okay. Now this one is what I hear a lot is a lot of trainers will argue you can get flexible just doing eccentric strength training. If that were the case, everyone who's ever picked up a barbell and done an RDL would be extremely flexible, and it's not the case at all. Again, I kind of went back earlier where I talked about passive versus active range. You actually have to have the range in the muscle to use it in your training, okay? So that's super important when we come to strength training. If you only have, say you're doing RDLs, right? Say you can only get to here before the back starts to round and the hips start to kind of hunch over, you're not getting any more flexibility, okay? If you can go all the way deep down and really get those hamstrings under stretch with the back flat, chances are you're going to increase flexibility. But also how long you do eccentrics for matters. Anywhere from 3 to 5 and upwards of 10 seconds sometimes. You can modify your tempos when you're training to get a bigger effect from your eccentric training. So if you have no time to stretch or whatever, my biggest advice would be to start adding longer tempo on your eccentric loading. So instead of just 2 or 3 seconds, 5 seconds down is really going to load those hamstrings up, get a good stretch, and then for multiple reps, if you just do the math in your head, the time and attention difference is going to be extremely significant just by adding 2 or 3 seconds to every single rep. Okay? So learn how to, as an athlete, I've never had one walk in this door perfectly flexible. You need to stretch, you need a passive stretch. You guys have been doing it, it's in our programs, it's there for you, it's written out. Hopefully you've been doing it. If you haven't, maybe after today you will. You have to start stretching separate of your strength training to start increasing your range of motion, which you can then use in your training to strengthen that range of motion and maintain your range of motion, okay? And after that, I kind of want to get into strength-tension relationship, right? So the biggest argument against flexibility is that it somehow disrupts your strength-tension relationship in regards to your sport or training for your sport, okay? So, again, this is discussed by people who don't actually really know what they're talking about, and they surely don't understand the application of stretching. And I'll explain what I mean by that. If I have a guy who comes in here and he has extremely flexible hamstrings, but has really tight quads and hip flexors, and all I do is put him in hamstring stretches, yes, flexibility will continue to contribute to the strength-tension relationship or the lack thereof, okay? That's not how we use stretching. No one ever said that you use stretching to further contribute to this issue. Most athletes that walk in these doors already have a strength-tension relationship issue. Why? Because they're so much tighter and stronger in so many different areas in their body than the other side, which is how we came up with our program. This is part of the basis that Poliquin realized when he came up with his structural balance numbers. How is it that you can take a guy off bench press for 4 to 6 weeks and put him on rotator cuff and increase your bench press PR? You have more range of motion, you have better force output from the opposing muscle groups, you have better stability, you actually have access to that range, right? So most athletes, this is already not ideal. It's already disruptive. Flexibility is not going to make it worse, especially the way we prescribe it, okay? If you're tight in certain areas, that's where you're going to spend a majority of your time stretching, period. All it's going to do is enhance this by opening up that range of motion. Now you can train the strength, and this gets better. You become more balanced. Guys come in, they do the quad stretch, and I always say, squeeze your glute. I can't feel my glute. I can't squeeze my glute. How do I squeeze my glute? There's your problem right there. How is it if you're sprinting and you get up to full extension, how is it you think you're going to use your glute if you can't actually feel it with the hip in full extension? You're inhibited. Your body will not go into that range. Your body will not be able to use the power it can generate in that range because it doesn't exist. So, again, this is already fucked up. Stretching is not going to make this worse, period. All right? And the last thing I kind of want to discuss today, and then I'm just going to talk about just a few stretches that I think are the most important for you to start with, and then we'll do a part 2 video kind of going over all the different muscle groups, the stretches for those muscle groups, and then the strength training exercises. And the last thing is intensity and consistency, okay? More times than not, I've had guys text me and ask how they can improve their flexibility. The first thing I ask them is, how long have you been doing it? This is not a joke. Majority of the time it's, oh, a week, 2 weeks. I've never had a person message me and say, oh, I've been stretching for 6 months, 8 months, a year. No. The first thing is going to be consistent. I don't care what you do, you have to do it, and you have to do it often. The other thing is how intensely you do it, okay? When you get into a stretch, you don't want to go 100%. Don't go into your full range of motion. Because if you go into your full range of motion, you're triggering the response in the body that you're getting into an area where your body's going to start to tense up. You can't increase your flexibility there. So what you want to do is you want to go, just like strength training, you want to spend a lot of time around 70 to 85% intensity. So don't go into a stretch and then go into your maximal range. Go into about 70, 80% of your maximal range, and from there breathe so your body relaxes into greater range of motion. So every once in a while I might get in a flexibility session, I'm really going to push it and see how far I can get, but it's about as rare as our 1 rep max squat. The respect should be treated the same, both for strength training and flexibility. And again, just to drive it home, you have to do that consistently week in and week out. So in terms of increasing flexibility, you're going to see changes. You're going to see changes. Some people see them really quickly within weeks, but you'll definitely start seeing them, 2 months, 3 months, you'll start to see big changes in your flexibility. But as far as, especially if you're somebody who's wanting the splits and you're basically coming from just your normal flexibility, you can't touch your toes, etc., you want to look at about 2 to 3 years, okay? That's the kind of timeline you want to put on increasing your flexibility. If you came in tomorrow and said, man, I want a one rep max, maybe you come in with a bodyweight squat and you want a double bodyweight squat. You're not going to get there in 4 weeks. You're not going to get there in 6 weeks. Chances are you're not going to get there in 6 months. But if you get it a year or 2 years, you're easily going to have a double bodyweight squat, as long as the intensity remains in a place that's safe, where you're not going to injure yourself, and the consistency is there. You show up week in and week out, and you just continue to work towards it. That's how you're going to increase your flexibility. Flexibility is important as an athlete, just to sustain your health and keep from being injured and perform better. So let's talk about 2 areas. Okay, your piriformis and your hip flexors. So if you only had to do 2 stretches, these would be the 2 I would do on top of my strength training. Say you're running out of time, or you just don't have them in your schedule, or whatever. These 2 are going to have the biggest impact on the flexibility of the rest of the body. Piriformis and hip flexors, both, the hip flexors are going to be responsible for the hips rotating forward and backward. Piriformis is going to be responsible for the tension in your hips side to side. So if a lot of guys squat and you rotate, this is usually the biggest cause of that, because you're tighter on one side than the other. So when you go to squat, the side that's tighter is going to shift your hips over to that side. Hip flexors, if you're trying to squat deep and you feel impingement in the hips, if your hips are already super tight here and you try to squat all the way down, now your hips don't have any room to move. So when you try to hit a bodyweight squat, what happens is you'll see that tailbone kind of tuck under, because now since you don't have the flexibility in the front of the hips, now your body's trying to get flexibility through the back or other areas. So these would be the 2 most important. They're going to have the biggest impact on just the structure of your entire body and how good you feel. These 2 areas will release more tension in your body than anywhere else. So if you've been following us, you have the 90-90 stretch for the piriformis, which is probably one of the more basic variations, where you sit, you have both legs at 90 degrees, you want to rotate and twist this hip forward, and then you bring your chest down towards the inside of your thigh, you can spend upwards of 3 minutes on your piriformis, right? So that's gonna be number one. And then from there, you can go out into more of like a pigeon stretch, which is gonna be more an intense variation. What you wanna watch is that this hip isn't rotated out, that this hip is rotated in. Okay, that's gonna get the stretch on the piriformis. And then the other one is just your standard hip flexor stretch. So you would get into like a lunge position, right? Just like in our split squat. You can bring the toes up or you can keep them down. I like the toes up just because it helps activate the glutes a little bit more. And you really want to squeeze the glutes, keep the chest up, and push the hip down towards the floor. A lot of guys try to stretch their hip flexors like this. It's not going to work. You need to keep the chest up over the hips. Making sure you're extending and dropping that hip towards the floor. All right, so these are going to be the two most important muscle groups, in my opinion, that are going to have the biggest effect through the rest of your body and in your training. Also because they're the two hardest areas to hit in your training as far as through a given range of motion. Obviously, split squats will help, but again, just like I talked about earlier, if you lack passive flexibility in the hip flexors, you're going to be limited in what you can do in your split squat. And then piriformis, it's a rotational muscle, so you hit it, but you never really hit it through a full range. It's through an end range anyway. Piriformis, hip flexors, two most important muscle groups to be stretching. And then we'll come back to you with a second video, probably in a couple weeks. Again, we'll break the body down by muscle group, and then we'll talk about what stretches to do per muscle group and what strength training exercises to use per muscle group to both increase and restore flexibility to the body.